The heavy gray mist of March 1800, and 90 clung to the jagged spires of Blackwood Manor, and the wind howled through the narrow corridors like the mourning of 1,000 forgotten ghosts. Isolde Vance stood before the towering iron gates, and she felt the cold rain soak through her thin traveling cloak. She was not here as a guest of honor, but as a sacrificial offering to the silent master of the North. Her father had been branded a traitor to the crown, and her brother's life now depended on the mercy of a man who had not spoken a single word in over 5 years. The Duke of Blackwood, Cedric Sterling, was a name whispered with fear in the drawing rooms of London. They called him the Mute Duke, and they said his soul had been extinguished during a terrible explosion on the battlefield. Isolde gripped her small trunk, and she looked up at the grim fortress of stone that was to be her new prison. She was a woman of codes and ciphers, and she was a genius who could find patterns in the stars. But she could not calculate the intentions of the man who had agreed to marry the daughter of a disgraced family. The heavy doors creaked open, and a butler with a face like withered parchment led her into the great hall. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and old wood, and the silence was so heavy that it made her ears ring. Cedric Sterling stood at the far end of the hall, framed by the flickering light of a massive fireplace. He was a tall man with shoulders as broad as the oars of a Viking ship, and his hair was as black as the midnight sea. He did not move as she approached, and he did not offer a single word of welcome. He wore a high collar that hid the scars on his neck, and his eyes were the color of smoke over a winter battlefield. He watched her with awe intensity that felt like a physical weight against her skin. Isolde curtsied low, and she told him that she was prepared to fulfill the terms of the agreement. Cedric did not nod, but he reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. He handed it to her with a gloved hand, and his touch was as cold as the frost on the window pane. Isolde opened the document, and she saw that it was a formal contract written in a sharp and jagged hand. The terms were simple, and they were absolute. She was to receive the protection of the Sterling name, and her brother's crimes would be wiped from the royal record. In return, she was never to leave the west wing of the manor, and she was never to seek the company of the Duke outside of formal obligations. It was a covenant of silence, and it was a bargain that demanded her total isolation. She looked up at him, and she asked if this was how he treated every guest who entered his home. Cedric merely looked at her, and he pointed toward the spiral staircase that led to the upper floors. There was no warmth in his gaze, and there was no pity for the girl who had sold her soul to save her family. He turned away and walked into the shadows of the library, leaving her alone in the vast and echoing silence of the hall. Isolde felt a shiver run down her spine, and she realized that she was now married to a man who was as dead as the stones of the castle. The butler led her to her new quarters in the west wing, and the rooms were filled with dusty furniture and faded tapestries. There were no flowers to greet the new Duchess, and there were no servants to attend to her needs, she sat on the edge of the bed, and she watched the rain lash against the narrow windows. She was a Vance, and she had been trained to endure the harshest winters of the soul. She took out her book of ciphers, and she began to write the first entry of her new life. She would not let the silence break her, and she would find the truth behind the Duke of Blackwood. Isolde began to explore the limits of her cage. During the first week of her stay, she found that the West Wing was a labyrinth of forgotten memories, and she found that the library was the only place where she could feel the presence of a living soul. She began to leave small notes, KP, in the pages of the books that Cedric favored. She wrote about the mathematics of the tides, and she wrote about the secret language of the flowers. She did not expect a response, but she found that the books would return to the shelves with a single line of ink added to the margins. The handwriting was Cedric S., and it was a silent conversation that began to bridge the gap between their worlds. He did not speak with his lips, but he spoke through the logic of his mind. Isolde felt a strange connection forming between them, and she realized that the Duke was not a hollow she-will, but he was a man who had built a fortress around his heart to protect a secret that could burn the world. She began to use her skills as a cryptographer to decode the subtle hints he left behind. She discovered that Cedric was not mute because of a physical wound, but he had chosen the silence as a weapon against the Marquis of Malfas. The Marquis was the man who had framed her father, and he was the man who sought to steal the strategic maps of the Empire. Cedric was the only one who held the key to the defense of the nation, and his silence was the only shield that remained. Isolde felt a surge of admiration for the man who was sacrificing his humanity to save his country, and she knew that she had found a partner in her struggle. One evening, as the clock struck 22 hours, 00 minutes, she found Cedric standing on the balcony, overlooking the sea. The wind caught his cloak, and he looked like a guardian of the abyss. Isolde approached him with a soft step, and she did not speak. She simply stood beside him and watched the waves crash against the rocks. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something that was not cold or distant. It was a shared understanding, and it was a recognition of the bond they had formed in the silence. He reached out and touched her hand, and his grip was steady, and it was firm. He did not say a word, but his eyes told her that she was no longer alone. They were two broken souls who had found a way to communicate through the darkness, and the contract they had signed was no longer a burden, but it was a promise of a future they would build together. The dawn was still a long way off, but the light of the stars was enough to guide them through the night. Isolde Vance was the Duchess of Blackwood, and she was the keeper of the silent covenant. She would protect her husband, and she would clear her father's name, and she would find the voice that had been lost in the fires of war. The game with Malfas was just beginning, and the secrets of the West Wing were waiting to be revealed. But for tonight, There was only the sound of the ocean and the beating of two hearts that had found their way home. The second week at Blackwood Manor brought a strange and quiet rhythm to the life of Isolde Vance, and she found that the silence of the Duke was not a void, but a complex language waiting to be deciphered. The West Wing was her kingdom of dust and faded velvet, and she spent her hours studying the shelves of the grand library that connected their two worlds. It was late March 1890, and the air was thick with the scent of rain and old parchment. Isolde began to leave her marks in the books that Cedric Sterling frequented, choosing volumes on naval history and advanced mathematics. She did not use words of affection, but she used the logic of her mind to catch his attention. She would write a small theorem or a subtle correction to a historical date in the margins using special ink she had crafted from crushed flower petals and a hint of expensive perfume. It was a fragrant ink that left a ghostly trail of jasmine whenever the pages were turned, and it was a signal that only a man with his heightened senses would notice. One evening, she found a copy of a treatise on celestial navigation lying on the mahogany desk, and she saw a response written in a bold and masculine hand. Cedric had not only solved her equation, but he had expanded upon it with brilliance that made her heart skip a beat. They began to talk through the ink and the paper, and their souls met in the quiet spaces between the lines. Isolde told him about her father and the false accusations of treason, and she felt the weight of her grief lift as she shared it with a man who also lived in the shadows. Cedric responded with quotes from the great philosophers, and he used the words of others to express the things he could no longer say. He told her that silence was a fortress, and he told her that the truth was a weapon that required patience to wield. Isolde realized that he was not CM because he lacked the ability to speak, but he had chosen to be still to protect a secret that was far greater than his own life. The tension in the manor began to shift from cold distance to magnetic pull, and every time their eyes met in the dimly lit corridors, the world seemed to stop spinning. Cedric looked at her with a gaze that was no longer empty, but it was filled with burning curiosity and deep respect. He watched her move through the gardens, and he noticed the way she counted the petals on the roses as if they were variables in cosmic calculation. Isolde felt his presence behind her, even when he did not make a sound, and she knew that the silent covenant was transforming into something far more dangerous than simple marriage of convenience. One night the clock struck 23 hours, 00 minutes, and a sudden cry from the kennels echoed through the stone walls. Isolde rushed to the balcony of the West Wing, and she saw a dark figure moving through the mist toward the Duke's private study. It was not a servant, but it was a shadow, dressed in the livery of the Marquis of Malfas. The intruder carried a blade that glinted in the moonlight, and he moved with the deadly intent of a professional assassin. Isolde did not hesitate, and she grabbed a heavy brass candle holder to use as a weapon. She reached the study just as the assassin lunged at Cedric, who was sitting at his desk surrounded by military maps. The Duke moved with a speed that was born of years on the battlefield, but he was caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the attack. The blade slashed across his shoulder, and a dark stain began to spread over his white linen shirt. Isolde threw the candle holder with precision that only a mathematician could achieve, and it struck the assassin on the temple with a sickening thud. The man stumbled, and Cedric used the moment to disarm him with a single and brutal movement of his arm. The intruder was pinned to the floor, and Cedric looked up at Isolde with a mixture of shock and profound and sudden gratitude. The Duke did not speak, but he gestured for her to stay back as he signaled for the guards to take the man away. Once the room was quiet again, Cedric sat heavily in his chair, and the blood continued to soak through his garment. He did not want the servants to see him in this state, and he motioned for Isolde to help him. It was the first time he had allowed anyone to touch him since the explosion 5 years ago, and the air in the room felt heavy with a new and electric energy. Isolde brought a basin of warm water and clean bandages, and she began to peel away the ruined silk of his shirt. She saw the scars that covered his chest and arms, and she saw the jagged mark of the blast that had stolen his voice. It was a map of pain and sacrifice, and she felt a tear escape her eye as she realized the depth of his suffering. She washed the new wound with a gentle hand, and she applied a soothing salve made of herbs and honey. Cedric did not flinch, but his eyes never left her face, and his breathing became slow and deep. The physical contact was a revelation for both of them. Isolde felt the warmth of his skin against her fingertips, and she felt the strength of the muscles that lay beneath the surface. Cedric reached out with his good arm and brushed a stray lock of hair away from her forehead. His touch was as light as a feather, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. He took a piece of paper from the desk and wrote a single sentence that made her breath catch in her throat. He told her that she was the only light he had ever found in the darkness of Blackwood. They sat together in the silence of the study as the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon. The danger was far from over, and they both knew that Malphas would strike again with even greater force. The Marquis was after the strategic maps of the Empire, and he would stop at nothing to destroy the sterling name. But for this moment, there was only the two of them and the silent understanding that they were no longer fighting alone. Isolde realized that she was not just his wife, but she was his partner. And she was the only one who could hear the music of his soul. As the sun rose over the cliffs, casting a golden glow over the harbor, Isolde returned to her quarters in the West Wing. She felt a new sense of purpose, and she felt the power of the bond that was growing between her and the Duke. They were two broken pieces that fit together perfectly, and they were ready to face the world with their own secret language. The game of ciphers and ink was just the beginning, and the path to freedom would be written in the blood of their enemies and the strength of their love. The grand ballroom of Blackwood Manor was a sea of shimmering silk and whispered deceptions. It was April 1890, and the air was thick with the scent of heavy lilies and the sharp metallic tang of hidden daggers. Lord Malthus had forced this occasion upon them, and he had demanded a masquerade that would bring the elite of London to the very doorstep of the mute Duke. Isolde Vance stood at the top of the marble staircase, her gown of midnight blue lace flowing around her like a dark river. She wore a silver mask shaped like a phoenix, and she felt the weight of her secret mission pressing against her ribs. Cedric Sterling stood beside her, looking like a dark king from a forgotten legend. His mask was a grim visage of hammered iron, and he did not speak, because his silence was the only wall that stood between his life and the hangman. Isolde felt a sudden surge of protective instinct as she looked at the husband who had become her silent partner. She had to be his voice tonight. She had to be his shield, and she had to be the most convincing duchess that the Tun had ever seen. They descended the stairs together, and the room fell into a hushed and expectant stillness. Lord Malthus stepped forward from the crowd, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light behind his golden mask. He bowed with a flourish that was more of a challenge than a gesture of respect, and he welcomed the Duke back to the society that had once turned its back on him. Isolde spoke for Cedric, her voice as smooth as velvet and as sharp as a needle. She told the guests that her husband preferred the quiet of the northern cliffs, but that they were honored to host such a distinguished gathering. The music of the orchestra swelled into a haunting waltz, and the masked figures began to spin across the floor like ghosts in a dream. Isolde moved through the crowd with a grace that was born of desperation, using her skills as a cryptographer to decode the subtle movements of the guests. She saw the way the servants carried the trays of champagne, and she noticed the way some of the men lingered near the heavy oak doors that led to the Duke's private study. She was a mathematician, and she was a woman of logic, but she could feel the cold breath of a trap closing in around them. She leaned closer to Cedric as they moved toward the center of the floor, and she whispered that the air felt like a storm was brewing beneath the floorboards. Cedric did not respond with words, but he tightened his grip on her hand, and his thumb traced a rhythmic pattern against her skin. It was a code they had developed in the quiet hours of the library, and it told her to stay alert and to watch the movements of Malthus. The Marquis was weaving through the guests like a serpent, and he was talking to a man dressed in the uniform of a high-ranking naval officer. Isolde realized that the target was not just the Duke, but the strategic maps of the Empire that were locked in the vault of the manor. Malthus wanted to provoke Cedric into speaking. He wanted to prove that the Duke was either a fraud or a traitor who was hiding behind a wall of silence. As the clock struck 22 hours, 00 minutes, Isolde noticed a strange discoloration in the punch bowl near the far corner of the room. Her knowledge of chemistry and her experience with the ciphers of the natural world told her that the liquid was not merely wine. It was tinted with a faint and sickly green hue, that suggested the presence of a neurotoxin. Malthus was planning to poison the entire assembly, and he would blame the Vance family legacy to destroy both Isolde and her husband. She moved toward the table with a practiced stumble, spilling her own glass into the bowl to neutralize the reaction. It was a small act. It was a calculated act, and it was a dangerous act. She felt a hand on her arm, and she turned to see the Marquis of Malthus smiling at her. He told her that she was a remarkably clever girl, for the daughter of a trader. And he asked her if she thought her silent husband could truly protect her from the consequences of her past. Isolde did not flinch, but she told him that the truth had a way of speaking louder than any man, and she said that the sterling name was a fortress that would not fall to a common thief. Malthus laughed, and the sound was like the dry rattle of a snake. He motioned for his men to move toward the west wing, and he told her that the dance was almost over. Isolde realized that the poison was only a distraction and that the real attack was happening upstairs. She found Cedric near the library doors, and she signaled to him using the secret language of her fingers. They rushed toward the study, passing through the shadows of the long corridor, while the music downstairs continued to mask their movements. They found two men trying to force the lock of the iron vault, and Cedric moved with a violence that was as sudden as a thunderbolt. He did not use a blade, but he used his bare hands to disarm the intruders with a cold and lethal efficiency. He was a man of war, and he was a guardian of the crown, and he would not let his secrets fall into the hands of the enemy. Isolde watched as he pinned the last man against the stone wall, and she saw the fire of 1,000 battlefields burning in his eyes. He did not speak, but the intensity of his silence was more terrifying than any scream. He turned to Isolde and handed her a small piece of parchment he had taken from the assassin's pocket. It was a coded message from Malthus, and it contained the final instructions for the destruction of the Sterling family. Isolde felt a surge of triumph because she now had the evidence she needed to expose the Marquis for the traitor that he was. She looked at her husband, and she saw the toll that the silence was taking on his soul. They stood together in the quiet of the study while the first light of the moon filtered through the high windows. The masquerade was still happening downstairs, but the real victory had been won in the darkness. Cedric reached out and touched her cheek, and his hand was trembling with raw and unfiltered emotion. He had chosen to be still to protect his nation, but he was beginning to find his voice through the woman who stood by his side. Isolde told him that they would face the trial together, and she said that the truth would finally set them both free. She was no longer just a girl looking for a way to survive, but she was the Duchess of Blackwood, and she was the keeper of the silent covenant. The clock struck 23 hours, 00 minutes as they returned to the ballroom. Malthus watched them from across the room, and his face turned pale as he realized that his men had failed. The dance of the masks was coming to a close, and the morning would bring the judgment of the crown. Isolde led Cedric toward the center of the floor, and they began to waltz with grace that was no longer performance, but a celebration of their bond. They were two souls who had found a way to speak without words, and they were ready for the battle that lay ahead. The shadows of the manor were long, but the light in their hearts was growing stronger with every passing moment. As the guests began to leave, Isolde felt a sense of peace that she had never known before. She had found a home, she had found a purpose, and she had found a man who was worth every sacrifice. The game of the Marquise was almost at an end, and the truth of the Vance family would soon be known to all. She held the coded parchment tight in her hand, and she knew that the dawn would bring the justice they deserved. They were the defenders of the silence, and they were the masters of their own destiny. The morning of the public trial arrived with a sky the color of cold iron, and the air in the great hall of justice was thick with the scent of damp wool and old scandals. It was May 1890, and the elite of London had gathered to witness the final ruin of the Vance family. Isolde Vance stood alone in the prisoner dock, and she felt the weight of 100 judgmental eyes pressing against her skin. She wore a simple gown of charcoal silk, and her only ornament was the silver wedding band that felt like an anchor in the storm. Lord Malphas sat among the accusers, and his face was a mask of cold triumph as he presented the forged documents that linked Isolde to the theft of the strategic maps. He spoke with a voice that was as smooth as oil and as sharp as a razor. And he told the judges that the daughter of a traitor had finally completed her father's work. He claimed that she had used her marriage to the Duke of Blackwood to infiltrate the royal archives. And he said that the poison found at the masquerade was a gift from her family legacy. The crowd murmured with a dark and hungry curiosity, and they looked at Isolde as if she were a venomous serpent that had finally been caught. She did not cry, and she did not beg for mercy, but she looked toward the back of the hall where Cedric Sterling sat in the shadows. He was as silent as the grave, and his face was carved from the same stone as his fortress by the sea. The Chief Justice leaned forward, and he told Isolde that the evidence against her was overwhelming. He said that the punishment for high treason was death by the axe, and he asked if she had any final words. Before the sentence was carried out, Isolde stood tall, and her voice was as clear as a bell in the quiet of the hall. She told the court that she was innocent, and she said that the true traitor was sitting among them in our golden mask of lies. She looked directly at Malphas, and she saw the flicker of fear in his eyes as she mentioned the coded parchment. She had recovered from the assassin, but the judges only laughed, and they said that the word of Vance was worth nothing in the eyes of the law. The executioner stepped forward, and he carried a heavy blade that glinted under the gaslights. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, and Isolde felt the cold breath of the end on the back of her neck. She looked at Cedric one last time, and she saw the agony that was tearing through his soul. He was the only man who held the truth, but to speak it would mean exposing the secret intelligence network of the empire. He had to choose between his country and the woman who had found the music in his silence. The hall fell into a hushed and terrible stillness as the axe was raised into the air. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence that was louder than a thunderclap. It was not a scream, and it was not a cry, but it was a human voice that had not been heard in 5 long years. Cedric Sterling stood up, and his voice echoed through the rafters like a command from the gods. He told the executioner to stop, and he told the judges that they were about to murder the most loyal servant of the crown. The crowd gasped with a collective shock, and the Marquis of Malphas turned as pale as a ghost. The mute Duke was no longer mute, and his words were a torrent of truth that swept through the hall like a cleansing fire. He walked toward the center of the floor with the stride of a conqueror, and he spoke of the night on the battlefield when he had seen Malphas selling secrets to the enemies of the Queen. He explained that he had chosen the silence to protect the locations of the hidden vaults. And he said that he had played the part of a broken man to lure the traitors into the light. He reached into his coat and pulled out the original ledger that proved the Vance family had been framed by the snake's eye. His voice was deep, and it was resonant, and it carried the authority of a man who had lived in the shadows for too long. Malphas tried to flee, but the royal guards blocked the exits with a wall of steel. The Marquis shouted that the Duke was a liar, and he said that Cedric was a rebel who had kept secrets from the Parliament. But the truth was now as visible as the sun. The Chief Justice ordered the immediate arrest of the Marquis, and the hall erupted into a chaos of cheers and whispers. Cedric did not look at the crowd, but he walked straight to the dock and took Isolde's hand in his. His touch was no longer cold, but it was burning with a raw and unfiltered passion. He told her that he was sorry it had taken him so long to find his voice, and he said that he would never be silent again. They left the Hall of Justice together, passing through the throngs of people who were now calling them heroes. The carriage was waiting for them in the rain, and they drove away from the city that had once tried to destroy them. Cedric sat beside her, and he did not stop talking. He told her about the wind on the cliffs, and he told her about the dreams he had kept locked away in his chest. He said that he was willing to give up his title, and he said that he would gladly live as a common man if it meant he could spend every day telling her that he loved her. Isolde rested her head on his shoulder, and she felt the vibrations of his voice against her skin. It was a miracle that she had never expected, and it was a victory that had been won with the strength of their bond. She told him that she did not need a duke, but she only needed the man who had stood by her in the darkness. They were going back to the sea, but this time they were going as free souls who no longer needed codes or ciphers to understand one another. The game of the snake's eye was over, and the trial of the century had ended in a scream of truth that would be remembered for generations. As they reached the edge of London, the first light of the moon began to break through the clouds. It was May 1890, and the world was a different place than it had been in the morning. They were the survivors of a silent covenant, and they were the masters of their own story. Cedric kissed her forehead, and he whispered that the dawn was coming. Isolde closed her eyes and listened to the sound of his breathing, knowing that the silence was finally gone for good. The golden sun of June 1890 climbed slowly over the white cliffs of the southern coast, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and salt. Isolde Vance stood by the open window of their small cottage, and she watched the waves dance against the shore with a gentle and rhythmic pulse. The noise of London was a fading echo, and the trials of the past months had become like a dream that vanishes upon waking. She was no longer a prisoner of her father's legacy, and she was no longer a pawn in a game of high treason. She was simply a woman who had found her peace in the arms of the man she loved. Cedric Sterling sat in the garden below her, and he was reading a book of poetry aloud to the birds and the wind. His voice was deep, and it was resonant, and it carried a warmth that Isolde felt in the very center of her soul. He had sheathed the heavy velvet of his dukedom and the cold iron of his silence, choosing instead to live as an ordinary man in this quiet corner of the world. He had given up his title and his lands to save her life, and he had told the Queen that his only remaining ambition was to be the husband that Isolde deserved. He looked up from his book and saw her watching him, and a smile of pure and unfiltered joy spread across his face. He called to her, and his voice was like a song that she never grew tired of hearing. He told her that the roses were beginning to open, and he said that the garden was waiting for her touch. Isolde descended the small wooden staircase, and she felt the soft grass beneath her feet. She joined him on the stone bench, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. They did not need ciphers or secret inks to understand one another anymore, and the silent covenant had been replaced by an open book of love and devotion. Cedric closed his book and took her hand in his, and his grip was as steady as the earth. He told her that he had spent 5 years locked in a cage of his own making, and he said that he had forgotten the sound of his own heart until she arrived at Blackwood. He confessed that the explosion on the battlefield had stolen his hope, but it was her logic and her courage that had given him back his voice. He told her that she was his greatest masterpiece, and he said that he would spend the rest of his life writing a new story with her. Isolde looked into his gray eyes, and she saw a future that was bright and free of shadows. She told him that she had spent her whole life looking for a pattern in the chaos, and she said that she had finally found it in him. The morning passed in a beautiful and lazy haze of conversation and laughter. They spoke of the manor they had left behind, and they spoke of the Marquis of Malfas, who was now serving a life sentence in the deepest dungeons of the empire. The secrets of the state were safe, and the honor of the Vance family had been restored to the history books. Cedric told her that he had received a letter from her brother, who was now studying mathematics in Paris. And he said that the boy was doing well. Isolde felt a wave of relief wash over her, and she realized that the sacrifice they had made was worth every moment of pain. As the clock reached 12 hours, 00 minutes, they walked together toward the edge of the cliff. The water below was a brilliant shade of turquoise, and the sky was a pale and endless blue. Cedric reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of charcoal, and he began to draw a sketch of her on smooth stone. He was not a professional artist, but he captured the curve of her smile and the light in her eyes with accuracy that only a lover could achieve. He told her that he wanted to remember this moment forever. And he said that this was the real beginning of their lives. They ate a simple lunch of fresh bread and honey on the grass, and they watched the fishing boats sail toward the horizon. The world was still full of politics and wars, but they were far away from the reach of the snake's eye. They were the masters of their own small kingdom, and their only laws were the ones they wrote for themselves. Isolde felt a sense of freedom that she had never known in the drawing rooms of the elite. She was a Vance, and she was a Sterling, and she was a warrior who had won her peace. Cedric began to recite a poem by a European author, and the words flowed through the air like a gentle stream. He spoke of the beauty of the dawn and the strength of the mountains, and he spoke of our love that grows stronger with every passing season. He told her that he had once feared the sound of his own voice because he thought it would only bring destruction. But now he knew that his voice was meant to be a bridge to her soul. He kissed her hand, and the touch was as light as a summer breeze. The sun began to set behind the western hills, casting a bloody and beautiful red glow over the water. It was the end of their first month of freedom, and it was the start of a lifetime of peace. They walked back to their cottage hand in hand, and the shadows of the evening were no longer terrifying, but they were a comfort. They were the survivors of a silent covenant, and they had found the truth in the heart of the darkness. Isolde looked at her husband and knew that she would never be silent again, and she knew that his voice would always be her home. As the stars began to appear in the velvet sky, at 21 hours 00 minutes, they sat together by the small fireplace. The flame was bright, and the room was warm, and the silence was no longer a burden, but a blessing. They were the keepers of the light, and they were the masters of their own destiny. The story of the mute duke and the cryptographer was over, and the story of Cedric and Isolde had only just begun.